So real quick before we actually jump into the message for today, there's two things that I want to mention. First of all, next Sunday is going to be a little bit of a different week for us. We did a thing a couple years ago for the first time, and then last year we didn't do it, but we're bringing it back this year. It was one of the messages that I said this last week, but people still quote the message from that week 2 years ago, and I don't know that that's really ever been the case with anything else. Now, I don't say that at all braggadociously because I'm not the one preaching it, and I didn't preach it then. So next week we're doing what we call 5 for 5. And what we're going to do during the message portion of the service next week is there's going to be 4 different people that each speak for about 6 minutes. So 5 for 5 sounds better, and it was supposed to be 5 for 5, but now we have 4. So it's going to be 5 for 5, but really 4 for 6. But it's going to be great. So we've got 4 different people that are going to be giving their own version or answering the question, how has God proven his faithfulness to you? And what I like about this is it's one thing for me to stand up here and tell you stories. I mean, for those of you that have been around, like you've heard some of the same stories over and over. It's one thing for me to get up here and do that, but it's a whole different thing when you get to hear from different people in your church family and you get to hear their stories of how God has been faithful to them. And so it's going to be a really, really fun week. It's going to be a lot different than anything else that we normally do. But the 4 individuals, I've been working with them on their content, and it's some really good stuff. So I'm excited about that. I hope you are too. So next Sunday is going to be 5 for 5, but really 4 for 6, but 5 for 5 because it sounds better. All right? That's the official title. The other thing is that this past Friday night, we had our first concession stand at Big Walnut High School. Now, for those of you that are new, you may not know what I'm talking about. As a church, we, for the last few years, have staffed Big Walnut High School's football concession stands for all their home games. We learned a few years back that parents have to staff those concession stands, and so we wanted to step in and help out and make sure that no parent had to be in a concession stand on a night that their kid was playing. And so we kind of adopted that as one of our things, and we had our first game this past Friday night, and I want to say a personal, huge, gigantic thank you to all of you who served this past week. We had, at the beginning of the week, Vanessa, my wife, who helps lead our outreach team, she was talking to me, and she was like, hey, I'm pretty nervous. I don't really know if we're going to get enough people, and like that's kind of a problem in that concession stand if you don't have enough people. And she's like, I'm just worried. I don't know how we're going to get enough people. And as I always do in every scenario, I was like, it'll be fine. It'll be all right. Don't worry. I don't know where they're going to come from, but it'll be fine. And by the end of the week, we had, I think, 30 different people sign up, and we had right around 30 people there. We needed like 23 to 24. We had almost 30 people. So for those of you that serve, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. I was able to talk with both the athletic director from the high school and the district superintendent for Big Walnut a little bit, and they both were, as they always are, but they were both extremely appreciative. The athletic director said, I just don't understand why you guys do this. It's crazy. And I was like, yeah, kind of. We got a bunch of people who love it, and we just want to give back. So thank you guys for making a difference in the lives of some people, all right? Now, all that said, let's jump into the message for today. In about 2010, I'm not totally sure of the year, but somewhere around 2010, Vanessa and I don't remember if we were married yet or we were about to get married or I don't remember exactly the details, but we made the decision that we wanted to get a little bit healthier in our lives. And so we decided to start going to a gym. Now, I played a lot of sports growing up, as you obviously can tell. But I've always hated working out. I've always hated running. Like it's boring to me. I want to be playing this, like I want to be doing the competitive part of it, not the like prep for the competitive part of it. Does that make sense? And so we decided we wanted to get healthy. We started going to this gym. Now, in my entire life, I have probably decided to start going to a gym 6 or 7 different times, and those have all lasted for maybe 2 sessions. That's about my success rate. So we go to the gym, but I also have this problem where I'm uber competitive. Sorry, Vanessa's giggling over there. I'm uber competitive, and my brain tells me that my body can do things that are unwise, okay? And so we go to this gym, and we get on some treadmills, and I'm like, man, I'm going to really push it. Like, I'm going to crush it today. And so we start going, and I'm going. And as we're going, I start to feel like a little bit lightheaded, but I'm like, that's all right. I haven't done this in a while. I'm fine. So I keep going. And I start to feel a little more lightheaded. I'm like, it'll pass. I'm good. It'll pass. I'm going. Well, eventually Vanessa looks at me and she's like, Andrew, are you okay? I'm like, yeah, I'm fine. Why? She's like, your whole face is white. I'm like, well, I'm a little lightheaded. I'm fine. She's like, no, you're not. Sit down. So long story short, I did not pass out, to be clear. I am stronger than that. However, I did have to sit against a wall in the gym and recover. And to be clear, this was approximately like 8 minutes into walking into the gym. I didn't expect that much laughter, or I may not have told that story. It was not one of my finest moments. So here's the thing. When we think about like people who go to a gym, which clearly, as I've illustrated, not me. When we think about people that like go to a gym and work out, like for those of us who are gym challenged, let's say, we might be like, man, I wish I had that kind of discipline, right? Like that's the word we would use. Like people who do that. My mom goes to a gym multiple days a week. I just did not get, not even a sliver of that genetic trait. But I might say like they're very disciplined, right? Like it requires you saying, I don't have to do this thing, but I'm going to do this thing because I know that it is good for me over the long haul. We would call that discipline, right? Now, today we are going to be talking about a topic that is challenging, and it's challenging because it uses the word discipline, but the word discipline is a word that for a lot of us, when we first think of that word, we don't think about it in terms of discipline like I'm going to go to the gym. We think about it in terms of like punishment. We think about it in a punitive sense, right? And you may not be that way, but probably for most of us, when we first hear that word, there's like a subconscious visceral reaction, and we get an image in our mind, and it's of like punishment, it's of doing something wrong, it's of, having to go to the principal's office for those of us that had to do that sometimes, and for those of us who didn't, you're boring. And it's like an image of my parents punishing me over and over, and phrases like this hurts me more than it's going to hurt you. Those kind of things. We get this image in our mind, I think for a lot of us, of discipline that carries a very negative connotation. And what the scripture that we're going to look at today, we need to kind of deal with that negative connotation right off the bat, because it can cause us to miss what's happening in the text today. And so as we start to read here in a moment, and we get to sections that are talking about discipline, there is an element of it where, and we're going to break this down more in a moment, but there is an element of a punitive kind of discipline. But I want you to think more in terms of the fact that discipline is broader than simply punishment, okay? In the book of Hebrews, scholars debate who wrote the book of Hebrews, but in the book of Hebrews, there's this like athletic metaphor that the writer of Hebrews uses throughout. At the beginning of Hebrews chapter 12, the writer talks about how we should run this race that we're all running, this race of life, with perseverance. The writer talks about how we're surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses, which is to say that there are people all around us in our lives who are on the same journey we are, who have experienced God in the same kinds of ways that we have, who are believers in Jesus. There's this great cloud, there's this great group of people all around us who are all running the same race. And so we should, in our faith, we should be thinking about running that race with strength and with endurance as a group. And so the image that you might get in your mind is thinking about like a marathon kind of a situation. Or maybe not a marathon, because that tends to spread out. Maybe like a 5K, right? You tend to end up with like clusters of people who kind of all run together. So the writer starts out chapter 12 by talking about this, and then immediately goes into a section that is extremely important for us today, but also, again, we can get derailed in it because of the image that we have of discipline. Now, the reason that I say this passage is important is because this passage talks extensively about how we deal with trouble, hardship, difficulty, pain, stuff in our lives that is not the way that we would want it to be. Over the last few months here at City North, I've talked to a lot of different people and I've heard a lot of different stories. And I know that for a lot of our church family, for whatever reason, there's a lot of heaviness. And that just is what it is. That kind of thing tends to ebb and flow. But for whatever reason, over the last few months, there's just been a lot of heaviness in people's lives. And so as we were preparing Summer at City North, going, oh, what are we going to talk about? I wanted to talk about heaviness. I wanted to hopefully give some hope in the midst of some difficult circumstances that some of you are facing. This passage stuck out to me. But as we talk about heaviness, we've got to talk about discipline. And that can be tough. Hebrews chapter 12. We're going to start in verse 4. And as we go through today, I'm going to kind of give a lot of commentary throughout this passage. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. And have you completely forgotten this word of encouragement that addresses you as a father addresses his son? It says, and we're going to pause right there. As the writer of Hebrews opens this particular section of this letter, again, keep in mind that the writer has just said, you're in this race. Think of yourself as in this race. And in this race, you need to run with endurance. You need to run with perseverance because you're surrounded by all these people who are running with you. And then they say, and you're struggling against sin. So it's kind of a quick transition. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. It's important to understand right off the bat that to the people that would have received this letter, it was not uncommon for them to have experienced and be experiencing physical persecution, physical punishment at the hands of the Roman Empire for their faith in Jesus. And so there were Christians at this point in time who were being killed for their faith, who were being tortured for their faith, who were literally shedding their blood in pursuit of their faith. This wasn't metaphorical. This was very, very literal. The writer's saying, hey, whoever it is that they wrote it to, whoever it is that received this letter, you haven't yet gotten to this point where the endurance of your faith has been tested as far as it can be tested. And then they say, and have you completely forgotten this word of encouragement? It's almost like they're saying, listen, your faith hasn't actually been tested as hard as you think it has been. And yet somehow in it, before you've even gotten to the hard parts, it's like you've forgotten this really important thing that you need to remember. And then he goes on to quote part of the Old Testament in the book of Proverbs, when the writer says, my son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline, and do not lose heart when he rebukes you. Because the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and he chastens. The Bible's tough sometimes, like when's the last time you used the word chastens in a sentence? For me, I'm confident it was the last time I preached Hebrews 12. He chastens everyone he accepts as a son. Now, the writer of Hebrews here is quoting, and he's quoting the Old Testament. He's quoting Proverbs 3, 11, and 12, which says, my son, do not despise the Lord's discipline and do not resent his rebuke, because the Lord disciplines those he loves as a father the son he delights in. So at this point, we've got the discipline word. And again, my hope is that when that word comes out, my hope is that you're not feeling like a visceral sense of negativity or of punishment necessarily. My hope is that we can look at it in a broader sense. My son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline. There are moments in our lives where God disciplines us. There are moments in our life where he hands down consequences for what we do. And the writer says, you've got to remember this thing that you already knew in your life. Do not lose heart when he does that. Because the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and the Lord chastens everyone he accepts. In other words, to make this as simple as possible, what the writer of Hebrews is saying is, if God didn't care about you, he would let you do whatever you wanted. As parents, hopefully, for those of us that are parents, hopefully it's easy to understand this dynamic. I had this conversation with my daughter last night for, the 47th time, ballpark. It's a conversation my parents had with me. It's a conversation many of us have had with our kids. If I let you do whatever you want, that's not me loving you. Because you can't do that in life. Brooklyn struggles with a lot of anxiety, my oldest. She's about to turn 10, and for whatever reason, she is wired as a super anxious kid, always has been. And she's been having these breakdowns at nighttime where she's really struggling to go to sleep, and it's been a real challenge. And it's gotten to the point where like our house is not very big, and her bedroom is right next to her brother's. Her two brothers are in the room right next to her, and she'll get to carrying on at nighttime to the point that they can't sleep. And so we've had to have conversations about like baby, you can't do that. You can't make them pay a price that they don't need to pay. And so we've got to try to like care for the anxiety, but then also deal with the behavior. And a lot of that is having these conversations around it's not loving, because she, in her mind, in her 9-year-old mind, it feels like mommy and daddy don't care when they say you can't do this. Where for us, we know, no, we wouldn't care if we let you do this, right? And so what the writer here is saying is, remember, when God does hard stuff into your life, he's not doing that because he just like wants to go, look. Psh. God is doing those things when he does them because any good father will hand down appropriate consequences to their children when they behave in ways that are destructive to them. What Brooklyn doesn't understand, because she doesn't have the perspective to understand it yet, as no kid does, what she doesn't understand is that when I'm handing down consequences, I'm not just doing it because like I want to watch her suffer. Like, this is not a sadistic thing. I'm doing this because I want her future to be healthy and to be productive and to be free of the pain that those kind of behaviors often cause in relationships, right? I'm doing this for her good, even though in that moment for her all she feels is pain. Now that idea that I just talked about, that idea the writer of Hebrews brings out as this passage continues. So now he said, the writer has said, you haven't actually struggled as much as you think you have. And it's like you've forgotten this really important truth. That when hard things happen, God is doing it because you're his children. And then he continues, the writer continues and gives some commentary on this. So I've given my commentary, but here's the writer's commentary. The writer says, endure hardship. That's an important phrase. If you're a note taker, you may want to circle that. Endure hardship as discipline. Endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as his children. For what children are not disciplined by their father? If you are not disciplined, and everyone undergoes discipline, then you are not legitimate, not true sons and daughters at all. I pause for a moment. Again, I want to make something very clear. I do not believe that the underlying Greek that this was written in is supporting taking the stance of saying all hardship is God's discipline. That's an important distinction. Because it can be easy to read this and go, oh, so if I'm going through hard things, it means God caused it in my life every time. I don't believe that's the case. There are scholars that disagree with me. I don't think the underlying Greek supports that. I think that beginning part, endure hardship as discipline, God is treating you as his children. I think a perhaps more clarifying way to translate it would be to say, endure hardship as if it is discipline. As if it is discipline. So in other words, God may or may not be causing the particular hardship you're in the midst of right now. But whether he is or isn't, we should look at it as if he is. Does that make sense? And there's an important reason for that. As the writer continues, they say, moreover, we have all had human fathers who disciplined us and we respected them for it. How much more should we submit to the Father of spirits and live? Pause real quick again. This verse, I think, in our culture may be one of the most problematic verses that we could read. Because a lot of us didn't have dads like that. A lot of us had fathers that were totally absent. A lot of us had fathers that were disciplinarians, but there was no kindness, there was no compassion, there was nothing underneath of it other than just, I want to discipline you. For some of us, in the worst of cases, we had fathers that were abusive. And when we read that line, there's something that like happens inside of us that is very, very negative and problematic. If that's you in this moment, I would ask that you take, as much as you're able, a step back from that and understand that there's a cultural difference here. That this is not something that the writer of Hebrews was writing intending for 21st century Americans to read it and go, well, yeah. In the culture that this was written in, that would have been true. For us, it may not be. It does not detract from the point of what the writer of Hebrews is saying. And so don't get hung up on that if that particular verse if it inflicts a little pain. So let's move on. As we look at why is it that it matters that we look at all hardship as if it is God's discipline. The writer says, they disciplined us, they being our fathers, they disciplined us for a little while as they thought best. But God disciplines us. And again, if you're a note taker, I would encourage you to circle or underline something the rest of the sentence. But God disciplines us for our good, in order that we may share in his holiness. That is a line that is just loaded with implications. As the writer continues, they address what is the most difficult part about talking about discipline. They say no discipline seems pleasant at the time. I mean, I don't know about you. Again, maybe you were a kid who never got in trouble. If so, I don't understand you. I just fundamentally don't understand you. There was never a scenario in my life where I was like, yeah, bring on the punishment, you know? Now, to hear my parents tell the story, almost nothing worked. So I didn't care, but I wasn't like jacked about it, you know? No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but it seems painful. Again, that's an important word if you're a note taker. No discipline seems pleasant, but it seems painful. And so the writer right here is acknowledging there are times that God disciplines us. And when God disciplines us, it is going to hurt. But, they say later on, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. Again, if you're a note taker, righteousness, peace, trained. Those are the words that jump out to me. In other words, the writer is saying, look, there are going to be times in our life where God disciplines us. Just like any good father will appropriately discipline their children. When God does that, we need to understand that it's going to hurt. Period. It's going to. There is no discipline that seems pleasant at the time. It's always going to hurt. It's always going to be uncomfortable. But God does it so that down the road it will produce a harvest, a large amount of righteousness, which is to say right standing, and peace. Peace. Now, when I think about discipline, the first word that comes to mind, like word associations, is not peace. And my guess is it's not peace for any of you either. Again, we think about conflict. We think about we think about discipline. We think about punishment. We think about the negative consequences of discipline in our lives. What the writer of Hebrews is saying is discipline from God. Discipline from God is always designed and intended for our good so that we can be right with him and have peace in our lives. And so as I say that I think that we need to look at every hardship we go through, not necessarily as God caused it, but every time there's pain, every time there's hardship, every time there's trouble in our lives, we should look at it as if it's God's discipline in our lives, is because if we look at hardship as if it's God's discipline and we are wrong and it's not God's discipline, nothing negative happens. Probably what will actually happen is God will speak to us and work in us along the way and teach us some things about ourselves. On the flip side of that, if we don't look at hardship and trouble and pain in our lives as if it is God's discipline, and it really is God's discipline, we run the risk of missing out on the peace God has for us. Does that make sense? And so by viewing any hardship, any difficulty, any pain as if it is God's discipline, we aren't assigning blame to God, but we're saying, okay, God, if I know that this thing, if I know that trouble and hardship is the path toward having peace, then I'm going to look at this as if it's you disciplining me, so teach me whatever you need to in it. And then we know, no matter what, we are on a road toward peace. Does that make sense? The discipline of God in our lives, when it is truly God's discipline, it leads to peace. The reason that it leads to peace, I'm going to jump back to an athletic metaphor because that's the world that I know and because the writer of Hebrews did it too. I think about playing basketball growing up, and we've identified how much I hate to run. I despised running at basketball practice. I mean, I hated it so much. I was like, there's plenty of running in the game. Like, can we just scrimmage for another 2 hours? We would run and we would run and we would run and we would run. And anybody that ever played sports, you know, like there's an excessive amount of running in just about every sport you play, right? And if you had a good coach, they would probably at some point explain to you why they made you run like fools. And sport to sport, I've never heard a coach give a different explanation than, I want to make sure that at the end of the game, nobody is ever able to outrun us. Right? Some version of that, right? If it's football, it's like if there's 2 minutes left in the game and we just score a touchdown and now we're up by 6 and we kick the ball off, they can't be in better condition than us and just run by us. In basketball, it's like if we're so worn out that we can't play good defense and they can just go by us, that's a problem. And at the end of the day, your coach even may have said something like, we may not be the most athletically talented or most athletically gifted people on the field, but we'll be the best conditioned. We may not be able to jump higher or whatever than them, but we'll outrun them because we can control that. We can control the condition that we're in. Now, there was never a scenario where during running I was like, yeah, we're going to outrun them. It was like, come on, coach. Can we be done? No, we're going to run more. It was painful. But there was a plan behind that, right? There's a process. What our coach knew, what your coach knew, what every coach knows is that if we run and we run and we run and we run, then when we need to run later, it won't hurt as much. And we'll be able to do it. Because we've trained ourselves to do it. That is exactly the idea that the writer of Hebrews is getting at here at the end. Later on, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. See, God's discipline in our life acts like those stupid suicides that we had to do on the basketball court, which I think they've renamed now, but I don't know. What is it? Is it still suicides? Thanks, Micah. Appreciate that. Good feedback. When we pushed our bodies like that when it didn't count, we could push our bodies like that when it did. In other words, it didn't mess with us as much in a game because we had built up the training and endurance. In the same way, when we endure with perseverance the discipline of God or just the hardships of life, viewing them as the discipline of God, what happens is we build up endurance so that over time, that stuff just doesn't mess with us the way it used to. And you know what happens when that stuff just doesn't mess with us the way it used to? We have peace. Because we know that no matter what happens, it isn't going to shake us. If your coach trained you well, you knew at the end of the game, we might not be able to beat this team, but we will keep up with them. Like you knew you could. There was no fear, there was no worry about like, man, are they just going to run us out of the gym? Because we could run with them. There was peace in knowing we could keep up. And in the same way, when God disciplines, when we view the hardship in our life as God's discipline, it builds endurance in us to where the next level of hardship just doesn't mess with us the same way the previous one did. But if we don't look at it as God's discipline, if we just look at it as, oh, life is the worst, and this person and that thing, and why can't we this, and when we take kind of that like pessimistic sort of approach to it, what happens is we never build up the endurance that we need to. And then the next round of hardship is just as hard as the previous round. I wish that I would have understood this earlier in my life. Students, you guys, hey, I love that you're all sitting together today. It's awesome. Students, learn this now. because your life is not going to get easier. I hate to tell you. Like, being an adult kind of sucks. It's like bills, and like if you want something, you have to pay for it, not your parents. And you got a lot to worry. There's a lot to worry about, and it's hard. It doesn't get easier. And then one day you have kids, and you're like, "Well, I know nothing about life at all." It's hard. And if you build the habit now of looking at the hard things as if, okay, what's God trying to teach me? What's God trying to show me? What's God trying to do in me through this? You will build an endurance and a peace that can last. And you'll be so far ahead of everybody else your age. Learn this now. So if I could summarize what the writer of Hebrews is doing here, what I would say is that God's purpose for pain is peace, not punishment. God's purpose for pain is peace, not punishment. For some of us, I talked about the father thing a moment ago. For some of us, our dad was a piece of work. And so when we see a passage that talks about fathers disciplining their children, there's this thing that happens very subconsciously in our brain where we go, God's punishing me. God's punishing me, because that's all we ever knew. That's not what God is doing. Even in the scenarios where God is disciplining, he's not disciplining for the sake of punishment. He's disciplining for the sake of peace. He's disciplining so that at some point, as you walk through this, and then as you walk through the next thing, and then the next thing, so that at some point along the way, the hard stuff just doesn't hurt as bad. And so that at some point you can have confidence in knowing that you can withstand anything because of what God has already done in your life. God's purpose for pain is peace, not punishment. And we could adjust that. We could say God's purpose for struggle is peace. God's purpose for hardship is peace. God's purpose for anything difficult in our lives, anything, whether he caused it or not, God's purpose for it is our peace. As a little bit of an aside, I think another thing that happens when we talk about this topic is that for some of us, we start to ask the question, so God is inflicting pain on me, and that feels troublesome. I would just say that I don't look at my coach making me run as him inflicting pain, right? He didn't walk up to me with a bat and hit me in the back of the legs. That'd be inflicting pain. Maybe some of yours did, and you should have had a different coach. He didn't inflict the pain on me, but he knew that the process to get to a better end was going to be painful. And so if you struggle a bit with feeling like, well, God inflicted this pain on me, and that just feels hurtful, and it feels like God doesn't inflict pain. God does at times hand out consequences that will be painful so that in the process we land in a place where we have peace. Does that make sense? I just wanted to deal with that really quickly. All right, so this is a significantly important truth to understand. This is a truth that is woven throughout the Bible in story upon story upon story. I think of Joseph when, if you know the story of Joseph, when his brothers came down from Israel to get food, and when he finally reveals himself to his brothers who had betrayed him and sold him into slavery and thought he had died, and they become very scared, and Joseph says, no. What you intended for harm, God intended for good, that I might save many lives. Like, this is an idea that's woven all throughout the Bible, but the writer of Hebrews goes on to do something as he ends this section and kind of gives some instructions that I've never really seen before and I think is so significant. So in Hebrews chapter 12, we're going to just continue right where we picked off, starting in verse 12. Therefore, strengthen your feeble arms and your weak knees. Make level paths for your feet so that the lame may not be disabled, but rather healed. When we were prepping this and I read that, I was like, well, just for a little bit of transparency, I read that and I was like, well, I don't know what that means. And I got nothing. The Bible can be difficult sometimes. So I consulted lots of commentaries and tried to understand a little bit better what was happening. The phrase, strengthen your feeble arms, the word feeble can be translated as drooping. And so when it talks about feeble arms and weak knees, the kind of image that I want you to have in your mind is this. Which makes sense, right? Like, that's how a lot of us get in our lives when we go through hardship, right? Strengthen your feeble arms and weak knees. I'm just kind of going through life like this. Now, when I was running suicides, and we finished a suicide, what did our coach say? Don't do this. Right? Do this. Now, come to find out, this actually is not the best way to do it, but whatever. Sorry, coaches, you were wrong. This also is not a good way to do it, though. Strengthening your feeble arms and your weak knees, for the writer of Hebrews, I think in their mind, they're thinking of exactly this kind of image of like, this is what I do when my arms are drooping and when my knees are weak. But when I'm strong, I don't do this, I stand. So strengthening your feeble arms and weak knees looks like standing up. What the writer of Hebrews is saying, hey, for those of you who are in pain, don't limp along like this. Stand up. Stand up remembering what I just reminded you of, that God's process, God's plan for difficult things in your life, it's not for you to just like wallow in it, but it's for you to find peace as you find endurance in the hard things. So stand up in the strength of knowing that this hurts like crazy right now, but it is not the end of the story. It's just one step along the way. And I don't want to minimize pain. Yes, it's painful. Yes, it hurts. And it might hurt more than you could possibly imagine. But the degree of the pain doesn't limit God's ability to redeem it for peace. It only limits our ability to remember that that's what God is doing. And so, stand up. Stand up. Strengthen your feeble arms and your weak knees. But then the writer says something else that is just weird to me because it's like a really fast transition. They say, make level paths for your feet so that the lame may not be disabled, but rather healed. Now, if you're a person with feeble arms and weak knees, how are you going to clear the way for somebody else who is lame? You're not. What the writer of Hebrews appears to be saying here, what they appear to be doing is shifting hard, but addressing the cloud of witnesses that they talked about earlier in Hebrews 12. And it's almost as if what they're saying is, hey, if you're weak, strengthen your feeble arms and weak knees. But if you're already strong, make level paths so that the lame, so that those who are still struggling with their feeble arms and weak knees, so that they can find healing. And so there seems to be kind of a dual thing happening. There's almost an address to the people who feel weak and an address to the people who feel strong. And this image of like, hey, we're in this together. So if you see your brothers and sisters struggling, make their path clear. And that is a beautiful picture of the body of Christ to me. There have been times, there have been moments, there have been seasons, some short, some long in my life where I needed some people to make the road clear for me because I didn't know how to get where I needed to go and I could barely limp along. And even when I stood up, it was still, man, like the steps were kind of, and if there was anything in my way, there's no way I was going to make it through that. In other words, think about it this way. When I played basketball, I had a lot of ankle problems. For whatever reason, I have loose ankles, and I sprain my ankles often. Tape them, brace them, the whole nine, and there you go. There was never a scenario where when I got hurt, that like my coaches and my trainers would come out and be like, well, you should have bought different shoes, man. It's probably a bad choice. Right? Like for whatever reason, in life, in like real physical scenarios, we kind of understand that when somebody gets hurt, that's not the time that we need to tell them how they should have done things different. That feels uncaring, right? And yet for some reason in the church, that's exactly what we do all the time. Somebody's struggling and limping along in their faith, and all we want to do is tell them what they're doing wrong. Well, that doesn't bring healing. That's like throwing marbles in the middle of somebody's path who's stumbling along. Or in our house, Legos. I'm not helping that person by when they're in the middle of pain and hardship by trying to tell them what all they should have done differently along the way and how like, well, there must be sin in your life. If you've ever used that phrase, please don't. That's throwing stuff into the path. What the writer of Hebrews says is clear the road. Why? Why do we clear the road? Because they say when we clear the road, the lame may not be disabled, they'll be healed. So as we stand up, as we strengthen our arms, our feeble arms and weak knees, we begin to find strength. And if the people who are around us have cleared the road for us, we will continue to find strength. And as we find that strength, then what happens? We now bear a responsibility to turn around and continue to clear the road for those who are behind us. And so I've got two takeaways. For those with pain, stand up. For those who are in the middle of hardship, stand up. For those who are in the middle of difficulty, stand up. And remember that God is good. And that whether God has caused or allowed whatever hardship, whatever pain is in your life right now, remember that it is not the end of your story. Remember that God is not finished with you. Remember that God is still working. He is still moving. He is still active. And if you will allow it, the road that he has you on today will lead to peace. Even if today you can't imagine that being possible. So stand up. And for those of us who have peace, level the road. So if you're a person who has pain in your life, stand up. And if you're a person who has peace in your life, look around you and level the road for the people that are struggling. Get the junk out of the way so that they can walk. Remove the barriers, remove the things that are difficult, and help them get to Jesus, who will heal them. When the body of Christ, the church, does this, the church becomes very much like a hospital for broken people. And the most incredible thing happens, according to the writer of Hebrews. The lame find healing. Not because of what we've done, not because we're the ones that brought them healing, but because we've smoothed the road to the one who can heal them. And over time, as we do it more and more and more, a peace develops in each of us individually and in each of us as a body. And I believe that if a church were to do that for a very long period of time, it would become a very, very, very bright light of hope in a world that has a tendency to shoot people when they're down. And what the writer of Hebrews is saying is, don't do that. In fact, for those of you that have peace in your relationship with God, smooth the road. Make it easy for people to get to God. Don't miss the significance of how God set this up. When you find healing, it is not just for your healing. It's also for you to be able to smooth the road for the people who still need healing in their lives. Now, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take about 5 minutes, and we're going to do something that's a little bit unusual that we've not really done here before. But we're going to take a few moments, and we're going to kind of put this into practice. We're going to like apply it right now. And so if you're new, this might feel a little bit odd. If you're newer to church, this might feel a little bit odd. That's okay. But we're going to take a few minutes, and we're going to do this in real time. Okay? And so I've got some instructions. What's going to happen in a minute is we're going to turn some music on. If you're a person who is struggling and in pain right now in your life, if you got hardship, if you are dealing with just stuff and you are weary and you are lame and you are stumbling along like this, I want you to take a minute and stand up. If you don't have the strength to stand on your own right now, then I want you to go to God because he does have the strength. I want you to pray. I want you to talk to God. I want you to ask him to give you what you need to stand. And I want you to ask him to give you what you need to remember that no matter the hardship, he has you on a road to peace. If you're a person today who is not in pain, but who is in peace, then I want you to level the road for some people. If you know people in this room who are struggling, I want you to go pray for them, pray with them. We're going to do some body of Christ stuff. We're going to pray with one another. We're going to bear one another's burdens. I want you to get up from your seat and go pray with people. And that might feel super awkward because we've never done anything like this. This is what the body does. And so if you're a person who's in peace, I want you to pray for some people in this room who you know that whether who you know have had some struggle. Go pray with them. Go speak words of encouragement over them. Go speak words of life over them. Go remind them that God is with them and that he is for them and that you're with them too. If you want to come up here and pray up here, you're more than welcome to do that. If you want to stay in your seat, I don't care. And if you're in this room and you're like, I don't know anybody yet, this is going to be awkward, I want you to do a couple things. Number one, just sit in your seat and pray that God would do whatever he needs to do in this room in this moment. It doesn't matter if you know the names or you know the stories. Your prayers are no less effective. Secondly, if there's anybody that you know needs prayer, anybody that you know in your entire life that needs prayer right now because they're in a hard spot, there are little red prayer cards in the back of all of these seats. Grab a prayer card and write a prayer request down and drop it in the silver buckets on your way out today, and our whole church will begin to pray for those people. So whether you know anybody in the room or not, there's a way for you to be a part of this today. We're going to take about 5 minutes and we're going to be the body of Christ to one another. For those who are weak, we're going to stand. Metaphorically, I don't mean literally. You have to stand if that's where you are, to be clear. If you're somebody who's in peace right now in your life, I want you to go pray for some people in this room. If you know their stories, if you don't, if you just feel like the Spirit's leading you to somebody, do it. And then in about 5 minutes, I'll come back up and I'm going to offer a benediction for us as we close. And if you want to stay in that space and you just want to continue praying, you are more than welcome to stay as long as you want today. We'll keep kind of some simple kind of prayer-ish music on. And if at that point you want to take off, you are more than welcome to take off. But we're going to sit in this moment and we're going to do this work together as a church family and see what kind of healing God brings to our lives.